What are professional boundaries? Well, to answer that, you need to back up. We all carry out a number of roles in our lives. Family members, spouse, brother or sister, son or daughter, members of organizations, members of social organizations or other organizations outside our work, and our professional roles. Boundaries you can think of as the invisible barriers that separate various roles and limit the kinds of interactions that are expected and considered ethically appropriate for each role. Because each of the roles has sets of behaviors that are considered appropriate, and then boundaries of what one does with that. When we think about professional boundaries related to our work, there's clear areas and then there's gray areas. Sometimes the boundaries are clear and obvious. Workers do not ask clients for loans, and workers are not involved sexually with clients. Period, paragraph, not supposed to happen. And others are not that clear. Sharing some of our own experiences, behaviors, and feelings with clients can be valuable as long as workers are very aware of the reason they're self-disclosing. They do it as briefly as possible and then focus back on the client with a comment or question. Because there's some reasons that I think are valid. One can be to reduce the distance between worker and client. That's the reason why I think in some ways having pictures of your family in your office is good, because people see you as a real person. I think some of the most valuable self-disclosures can be if a client says, "I love vanilla ice cream," and the worker says, "Me too." That's not deeply personal information, well, depending on what you think about ice cream. But it's one of those kinds of things where there's something in common, and that can really help to do that. A few moments of mutual complaining about your 4-year-old's behaviors is not a bad thing to do. But then again, to go back, to model appropriate behavior. I know workers who very carefully talk about the difficulties they have in getting everything done with clients who are disorganized, who have trouble getting late, not telling them what to do, but just showing them an example of somebody who's managed to multitask relatively effectively a good bit of the time. Sometimes it indirectly provides information. When I've worked, I've shared stories of other clients. Essentially, it's not my self-disclosure, but it's talking about, there was somebody who was here about a year ago, kids about your age, and just kind of talking about them, not because telling people what to do doesn't work, but sometimes, talking and telling stories indirectly provides that information that people can latch onto. And I think the other thing about self-disclosure is that sometimes as a way of answering that question, what would you do if you were in my situation? You don't get that often, but sometimes you do. Well, what do you think I should do? Well, I'm not you. Well, what would you do if you were in my situation? And you can try to deflect it, and sometimes that works. But I've found a couple of times I just have to say, I need to tell you a little bit about ways in which we're different. I mean, one of the things right now is that if someone said, well, what would you do if you were unemployed and couldn't find a job? I'd say, I have trouble understanding that. I speak Spanish real well. Right now, somebody who does social services and speaks Spanish doesn't have much trouble getting a job. I don't really worry, about that as a possibility. Or I had somebody who said she worked with 18 and 19-year-old girls in a program for homeless early adults, late adolescents coming out of foster care. One of them said, "Ms. Marvel, what would you do if you were in my situation?" And she said, "Honey, I can't even remember what it was like to be 19. I can't even see 19 from here." It brought some humor, but it was just to say, you can't put yourself in someone else's situation. But it answers that question without refusing to do that. When we think about dual or multiple relationships, the question is, when is it appropriate to interact with clients outside the work setting? Dual relationships a complicated way of saying you interact with a person in more than one role: neighbor, member of the same church, etc. Social Work Code of Ethics says that dual relationships should be avoided when there's a chance of exploitation or potential harm to the client. But avoiding multiple relationships is difficult because in a small town or a neighborhood in which the workers lived for a number of years, lots of people are known in multiple ways. I can think of one person I know in at least 6 ways in the small town in which I live, all the different kinds of roles. And it's also sometimes difficult to think about, when is this person no longer a client? If people come to the Salvation Army, has come for a while and occasionally comes back when there's a major financial need and someone's relatively stable, and coming back, if the person comes back after 2 or 3 years and needs money for the first time to make rent payments, and it's been 2 years since they've been back, that's major good news, right, in terms of what the person's life was before. But is that person always going to be a client? Is there always going to be that relationship? And also just the concept of helping relationship is very culture specific. The question, is it ever acceptable to accept a gift from a client? Someone brings in a dozen freshly baked chocolate chip cookies for you because you're so wonderful. Then what do you do? The best answer I heard from that was someone who said, I accepted on behalf of the Salvation Army. I didn't do this for you, the Salvation Army did it, and I'm going to share it with staff. And you hope the person would remember to do that while there's still 3 or 4 cookies left in the box. A more personal gift is more difficult. If the gift is something that strains the client's resources, that's another kind of an issue. Sometimes it may do more harm than good to refuse a gift, because again, things may be culture specific in terms of what's appropriate and inappropriate to do. I remember when about more than 10 years ago now, we're in the small town where I live in, the first real influx of Latinos into the community, and the school district was trying to cope with it, and we did a program called FAST, Families and Schools Together. Very good program that involves the family. And we did a couple of these in Spanish, and so they asked me to be involved in that, which I did and which I enjoyed. And I was doing home visits on a Sunday afternoon to the families that had been identified. They knew I was going to come, but we were talking about this. And so I made 4 home visits, and at the end of it was more stuff than any Thanksgiving dinner I've ever been to, because every place I did, people offered me food, and it would just have been rude, So the last couple of times I was eating less, but there still was kind of coffee sloshing around my stomach, and I just, you just kind of teeter away, and hope your stomach recovers. But it would have been rude, because there's a way in which sometimes, well, you can refuse once and that's okay, but you can't refuse the 3rd time. And so in some cases you may accept. The main thing, though, because it's again one of those gray areas, the type of gift, the monetary gift, value of the gift, the cultural context, they're all important in deciding if the gift is appropriate. Instead of looking for easy answers, what we need to do is we need to accept the complexity of maintaining boundaries, admit we'll have boundary dilemmas at times, and probably different people will have different boundary dilemmas at times. And we need to share those with colleagues. We need to be able to say, here's a situation, I may be too close to it. I don't know what to do. What would you think? And then also to think about the kid on the shoulder. Would you be comfortable with your actions if your children were observing you, if your parents were observing you? I've found often if I say, if my daughter knew I was doing this, would she think it was a good thing? If my 87-year-old mom knew I was doing it, would she think it was a good thing? It's not a bad rule of thumb. Complicated things, we just keep talking.